When the HOA slapped us with a $670 fine for a petty violation, we never imagined it would escalate to the police being called. But when the sheriff arrived, he didn't just enforce the fine, he turned the tables and asked my wife for orders. What happened next shocked the whole neighborhood. It was an ordinary afternoon in our otherwise peaceful suburban neighborhood. The sun was shining, casting a warm glow on the neatly manicured lawns, and the sound of children playing in the streets filled the air. We had always loved this quiet neighborhood, where the most exciting thing that ever happened was the occasional yard sale or the annual block party. But that afternoon, everything changed. It all began with a letter from the Homeowners Association HOA. At first, it seemed like just another routine communication, one of those newsletters filled with updates and reminders. But when I opened it, my heart sank. The letter stated that we had been fined $670 for non-compliance with one of the HOA's landscaping rules. The reason? The hedges in our front yard weren't trimmed to the precise specifications laid out by the HOA. Now, let me make one thing clear. Our yard was beautiful. The grass was lush and green. The flowers were in full bloom, and the bushes were healthy. But apparently, they didn't fit the exact measurement that the HOA required. The fine was stiff $670 for something so trivial. It was like being punished for breathing too loudly. I showed the letter to Sarah, my wife. She wasn't happy, to say the least. Sarah had always been the type of person who believed in fairness and reason, and this fine didn't seem to be either of those things. She read the letter with a furrowed brow, and then turned to me. "This is absurd," she said, shaking her head. "I'm not paying this." She was resolute. We had never been ones to bend to the whims of the HOA, but this felt different. The fine was excessive, and the rule itself seemed petty. Sarah, however, wasn't going to let this go. She wrote back to the HOA, explaining that the fine was unreasonable and asking them to reconsider. She also mentioned that the rule was vague and that we had made a good faith effort to comply. But we both knew this wouldn't be the end of it. A few days later, we received another letter. This time, it wasn't from the HOA directly. It was a notice that a sheriff's deputy would be coming to our home to enforce the fine. I couldn't believe it. The HOA had escalated this nonsense to law enforcement. Sarah's frustration reached new heights. She was furious, not just about the fine, but at the idea that something as trivial as landscaping could bring the police into our lives. "I'm not backing down," she said, her voice firm. "This is our home. We've done nothing wrong, and I won't let them intimidate us." When the sheriff's deputy, Officer Mark Lawson, arrived at our doorstep, the tension in the air was palpable. He was a tall, middle-aged man with a stern face, but there was something about him that suggested he didn't enjoy being in this position. His uniform was crisp, but his demeanor was hesitant. He explained that he had been called to ensure that the fine was enforced. He even seemed a little uncomfortable as he read the details of the situation. "Ma'am, I'm here because the HOA has asked for the fine to be enforced," Officer Lawson said. "But I need to make sure everything checks out before I can proceed." Sarah took a deep breath. "I'm sorry, officer, but this fine is not valid. It's based on a ridiculous rule, and we've already explained that we made every effort to comply." "I'm not paying it." The officer looked at her for a moment, and then glanced around at our yard. It was clear to him that there was no real issue here. The hedges were well maintained, and the entire yard looked neat and tidy. There was no reason for a $670 fine. But still, he was in a bind. He had been called out by the HOA, and he had a job to do. "I understand your frustration," Officer Lawson said, "but I'm just following orders. If the HOA has issued a fine, I have to make sure it's paid." Sarah was growing more agitated by the minute. "This isn't right," she said, her voice rising. "This isn't a criminal matter. We're not breaking any laws, and we shouldn't have to pay this fine just because someone in the HOA doesn't like the way our yard looks. It's not even their business." "I understand, ma'am," the officer said, his tone softening. "But the HOA has called me to enforce this, and I have to do my job." It was clear that Officer Lawson was conflicted. He didn't seem like the type of person who would enjoy getting involved in a petty neighborhood dispute. But he was also bound by his duty to the HOA. He was caught in a tough spot. And that's when Sarah, without missing a beat, said something that would change the entire course of the conversation. "Then I'll ask you this," Sarah said, her voice calm but filled with authority. "If it were up to you, what would you do?" The officer hesitated. "I don't have the authority to override the HOA's decision, but if I were in your shoes, I'd be frustrated too. Sarah's eyes narrowed. Well, officer, if it were up to me, I'd tell you to disregard this fine entirely. It's absurd, and it's a waste of your time. You shouldn't be here, enforcing this ridiculous rule. Officer Lawson blinked, caught off guard by her assertiveness. He was expecting more of a defensive response, but Sarah wasn't backing down. She was standing up for what she believed was right, and she wasn't about to let the HOA or anyone else push her around. I'm going to have to speak with Karen about this, the officer said, turning toward the woman from the HOA who had come with him. She was standing off to the side, her arms crossed, glaring at us with an air of superiority. Karen had always been the type to enjoy enforcing rules, and it seemed that this situation was no different. The officer approached Karen, speaking in a hushed tone, but I could still hear snippets of their conversation. This is really a matter for the HOA to handle, not law enforcement, Officer Lawson said, clearly uncomfortable. We can't be involved in something like this. It's a civil matter, not a criminal one. Karen, however, was not having it. But this is a violation of the rules, she insisted. We can't just let people get away with ignoring the HOA's authority. Karen, Officer Lawson said, his voice firm now. This isn't something I can enforce. The law doesn't support this. You'll need to take this up with the HOA board. But I won't be issuing any fines today. Karen's face reddened with frustration. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. Instead, she turned on her heel and stomped back to her car, muttering under her breath. It was clear that she had lost. The officer turned to Sarah, a look of relief in his eyes. Ma'am, I'm sorry for the inconvenience, he said. I can't be involved in this. I'll report back to the HOA. But this isn't something the police should be handling. With that, the officer walked away, and the confrontation was over. As soon as he was gone, Sarah let out a long breath, her shoulders relaxing. Well, that was something, she said, shaking her head. I can't believe they called the cops for something so stupid, but despite the frustration, there was a sense of victory in the air. Sarah had stood her ground, and the HOA had been forced to back down. What had started as a petty dispute over hedges had turned into a victory not just for us, but for anyone who had ever been intimidated by the power of the HOA. In the following days, word spread through the neighborhood. People who had always been too afraid to challenge the HOA began to speak out. Sarah's defiance had sparked something in them, and they too began to question the authority of the HOA. The atmosphere in the neighborhood started to shift. People were beginning to see that they didn't have to live in fear of an overbearing HOA board member who seemed to enjoy wielding power. As for Karen, she wasn't seen much around the neighborhood after that. The HOA had to reevaluate its policies, and Karen, who had once been the unquestioned enforcer, was now facing scrutiny from her fellow board members. It was clear that her methods were no longer acceptable. The $670 fine wasn't refunded, but Sarah had achieved something more valuable. She had reminded everyone in the neighborhood that they could stand up to unreasonable authority. The power had shifted, and the HOA no longer held the same sway over the community. And for that, we were grateful. As for us, life returned to normal. Our yard remained as it always had been, beautiful and well kept, and we didn't have to worry about the HOA sending us ridiculous fines. We had learned that sometimes standing up for what's right, even in the face of small challenges, can have a bigger impact than we ever imagined.